It's snowing heavily in the city of Moscow, Idaho. The icy wind is blowing through the quiet streets where only one car drives every half an hour. This is a small town, and life here never changes much, but tonight it will be different. In less than an hour, 4 university students will be brutally murdered in their beds in the middle of the night. Who could do such a thing and why? And how was the main suspect, Bryan Kohberger, a trainee professor of criminology, caught? What details of the case made everyone shudder? Let's sort it out. November 13, 2022, 1:40 a.m. The killer is still on the loose, but the police are already calling this case a massacre. Kaylee, Madison, Ethan and Xana are found dead in their beds in a house located on the outskirts of the campus of the University of Idaho. Their lifeless bodies lie side by side in the same room. The scene is so horrible that even veteran officers cannot hold back their tears. Everyone in town is shocked. Someone could commit such a heinous crime. Parents are afraid to let their children go to university. Professors can't believe that their former student is capable of such cruelty. But these people didn't know Bryan very well. He always kept to himself, although his colleagues noted his strange behavior. When Bryan first came to work at the university, he surprised everyone with his intelligence. He knew a lot about crimes and criminals. At the same time, he seemed somewhat weird. After classes, he would stand for hours by the window and stare out into the street. Once someone saw him talking to himself. A few weeks before the tragedy, he began taking long nighttime walks around campus. But that's not the strangest part. Phone GPS data shows that the day before the crime, Bryan drove past the house on King Road more than a dozen times, and each time he was alone. Nobody knows what he was doing. But now we know that the young man had been watching the students living there. So who exactly lives in this house, and why did the maniac choose it? Xana Kernald and her roommate Madison Morgan are second-year students. They met at the university, and then became inseparable friends. Both girls wanted to become criminologists. Kaylee Goncalves and Ethan Chapin are a couple. They fell in love while studying for their bachelor's degrees. Kaylee is a psychology major, and Ethan, a young man from Washington State, studies recreation, sports and tourism. All 4 of them have a wonderful sense of humor, are cheerful and optimistic. And their parents are very proud of their achievements. When they received the news of their deaths, the whole world mourned with them. Bryan Kohberger must have known that. But what did he hope to gain by committing this heinous crime? The murderer acted very carefully. There were no signs of forced entry, which means he must have known the residents personally. In fact, he probably had more than one meeting with them. For example, Ethan often played video games with Kaylee's brother. It's also known that Xana dated one of Bryan's friends. So when the guy returned home from his trip, he probably learned from his friend that the house on King Road was practically empty. The other students were on Thanksgiving vacation. Only Madison, Xana, Kaylee, and Ethan stayed behind. The killer chose his victims because he knew that they would not be able to resist him. What did the investigation team focus on first? The police officers immediately noticed 2 important things. First, the weapon used by the killer. All the victims suffered deep knife wounds, which indicates that the murderer brought a large and sharp knife with him. Second, the murder weapon was left at the crime scene. Such negligence suggests that the maniac was either very confident in his own strength or was completely devoid of emotions. What if he wasn't acting alone? There were no signs of robbery, so the motive was not material gain. Was it personal hatred? But if so, why did the killer spare the 6 other students living nearby? 3 days after the crime, Bryan Kohberger boarded a bus to Washington, D.C. It was very unusual for him to use public transportation, but he had no choice. His white Hyundai Elantra was spotted on surveillance cameras at gas stations and fast food restaurants along the way. As soon as the police got their hands on the footage, they released it to the public. Several people recognized the car and the driver. Someone even managed to film the license plate number. That's how Bryan Kohberger ended up on the federal wanted list. But how did the police find DNA evidence that directly linked him to the crime? On November 25, 2022, a resident of Pennsylvania noticed that a stranger was sitting in her backyard. The woman asked him if he was lost, but the young man said he was just enjoying the view. Then he got up and walked away. Bryan Kohberger didn't realize that he had been filmed. The next day, the police showed the woman a photo of Bryan, and she confirmed that it was the same guy. However, she had no idea that she had seen a dangerous criminal right in her own backyard. That's how the FBI learned that, after the crime, Bryan went to see his parents who live in Pennsylvania. The officers immediately searched the house but didn't find the fugitive. However, they did find some interesting things. The agents found a large knife sharpener, a leather sheath, and a crystal goblet in the trash. The goblet has special meaning in criminology. Bryan studied the subject thoroughly and must have known that the police would pay attention to glass fragments at the crime scene, so he threw the cup away to divert suspicion. But it was the most common mistake. The killer underestimated the investigators. Meanwhile, Bryan Kohberger had already crossed the country twice. When he arrived at his parents' house, he immediately took a shower and changed his clothes. Then he drove to New York City, where he worked as a waiter in a sushi restaurant. The police checked the surveillance cameras and saw the wanted man working at the sushi bar. He looked tired and haggard, but he was still the same polite and intelligent young man. Customers liked him and left good reviews. No one even thought that Bryan Kohberger was hiding from the police. On December 9, the FBI finally reached Bryan. His father called the police and invited them to search the house once again. Maybe he hoped that his son was just hiding somewhere in the basement. However, the police found nothing in the house. Bryan Kohberger was nowhere to be found. What was he doing all this time? The investigators decided to check his phone location history. It turned out that the young man was wandering around the neighborhood where the students lived several times before the crime. He must have been scouting the area. It is also known that after the murder, Bryan returned to Washington State University. He attended his criminology class the next day and discussed the Idaho massacre with his colleagues. Can you imagine what a monster that is? Despite all the evidence against him, Bryan remained calm. He joked with his colleagues and no one suspected that he was involved in the crime. On December 13, Bryan was taken to the police station. They didn't beat around the bush and immediately showed him the DNA test results. It was found on a knife sheath left at the crime scene. The probability that it belonged to Bryan Kohberger is 99.9%. By the way, that's far from the only piece of evidence. Fingerprint experts also found his fingerprints on the sheath, but Bryan was not arrested right away. He was offered a deal. If he confessed, he would get a reduced sentence. The suspect didn't agree. All we know about the true motive behind the crime is that Bryan Kohberger planned everything in advance. He chose the victims and the time of the attack. But was he acting alone or was there an accomplice? Why did he choose this particular house? What was the point of leaving DNA evidence behind? Is Bryan Kohberger a cold-hearted killer or just a victim of a more complex plot? Share your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed the video, hit the like button and watch another similar story on your screen.